All right. Alexander and Parmenio, balance, dichotomies, and the golden mean. It's a bit of a mouthful of a title, but this lecture came out of a theme that I saw cropping up across various things that I was researching. One was a lecture series and the works of Plutarch and Arrian on the life of Alexander the Great. One was I've been rereading The Dichotomies of Leadership by Jocko, Willink and Leif Babin. And the other is in an ethical teaching context. I've been talking about Aristotle quite a lot lately. And all of them, I think, share a very similar idea in terms of finding balance and the need for balance to be appropriate. And so, put it in lecture format, and hopefully we can gain a better understanding today of the role that balance plays, how we find balance between competing extremes in our life, and how we can move forward more productively. So, the scope of this lecture, we're going to start with Alexander and Parmenio, so Alexander the Great and his general Parmenio. And I've called that section Alexander and Parmenio, Pothos and Prudence. More on Pothos in a moment. We're then going to look at the golden mean in Aristotle. We're going to look at the dichotomy of leadership. And then we're going to do a bit of work identifying where we might need more balance or need to adapt to find a balance point within our own lives. So, straight on to that first bit. Alexander and Parmenio, Pothos and Prudence, with Alexander III of Macedon. Pothos, we should define at the outset, is a word most commonly associated with Alexander. It's also associated with death to some extent, being the name given to the flowers that were put on the graves of dead Achaeans. But Pothos is a yearning or a striving, potentially for an impossible goal, although Alexander's career probably indicates that impossible is not a word best used to describe his goals. Pothos is a yearning, a belief that you can be so much more than you're currently demonstrating, and a real feeling of insufficiency at not already being there. And it is the thing that, throughout the course of Alexander's short life, really is highlighted again and again and again, particularly by Arrian, but also in the works of Plutarch, that Pothos is what drives Alexander. Some people kind of put a modern context on it and they're like, oh, well, he's a bit of a megalomaniac, he's a bit of a kind of capitalist, or he's very egocentric. And while certainly there are some elements of that that are undeniably true in the building of an empire like Alexander did, I think it's the wrong lens through which to view it. I think if we look at these four events, if we look at his belief that he's a descendant of Heracles and Achilles, if we look at that great incident with his tutor Leonidas, the taming of Bucephalus and the Battle of Issus, I think we see that Pothos is the driving force. And I've chosen those four events because I think they give anyone unfamiliar with the source material a good insight into the character of Alexander when he sets out on campaign, but also I think they are representative. I don't think they hide anything from kind of the excesses that Alexander goes to, while the scope of this lecture will not include the stuff that occurs later on towards the end of his life with putting down rebellions and other things, because we're focused on finding balance in the building. I don't deny that those things exist and that they're problematic. Alexander is no paragon of moral virtue, but his life teaches us really valuable lessons. So let's get into it. The first is that Alexander believed he was a descendant of both Heracles, son of Zeus, and Achilles, hero of the Trojan War. So his father, the Argead line of Macedonian kings, claimed their descendancy from the Doric lineage of Greeks, who themselves considered themselves to be the descendants of Heracles. And so all through that line, through the Doric line of Greeks, which includes people like the Spartans, thought that they were descended from Heracles in the same way. The Argead kings of Macedon thought they were the direct descendants of Heracles. And so to some sense, they are part of a divine lineage. The apotheosis of Heracles as he joins the Olympians being kind of really key there. The second is that through the royal house of Epirus, Alexander believed he was also descended from Achilles, and this becomes a really important motif throughout his life. He holds the stories of Achilles in the Iliad to heart. He tries to emulate Achilles in a number of parts of his life, and that's really clear as a motif. But through his mother's line, he does claim descendancy from Achilles, through Achilles' son Neoptolemus, down through the royal house of Epirus, and into his mother Olympias, who then marries his father Philip. And so you have in this individual, if you leave aside all of the other perhaps somewhat more spurious signs at the point of Alexander's birth, at the very least, he is born into a world where great things are to be expected because he is considered to be divine in these two separate ways. And while his mother Olympias will certainly stoke that a great deal, on the face of it, it is no doubt surprising to anyone at the outset that this is a man who grew to have such great ambition. He saw himself in the image of both of these heroes, and eventually, although it's not a topic we'll get into today, does at least project an image. We're unsure, and I don't think anyone can be sure as to whether he ardently believed it himself, that he actually believed himself to be a direct son of Zeus, or Zeus Ammon. So there's a divine context to the personhood of Alexander. We also have this fantastic story where Alexander, as a young boy, probably no more than 8, is being taught by his rather stern tutor called Leonidas, no relation as far as we can work out to the famous Spartan king killed at Thermopylae. And as part of his tutoring, he's being taught how to burn incense on the sacrificial altar in the home. And in doing so, you put like a small measure of incense, creates a nice fragrance, wafts up to the gods, all that kind of thing. And Alexander, as a young boy, takes 2 fistfuls of incense, really expensive material, and he throws 2 fistfuls of it on the fire. And for all the conflagration and the smoke billowing everywhere that we can imagine, his tutor rebukes him and says, when you've conquered the spice-growing regions of the world, then you can use all the incense you want. But for right now, you don't waste it. And, it's a fair enough lesson to teach a young boy. Except that many years later, Alexander, as he was wont to do, sent gifts home to Macedon after his victories. And after he conquered the city of Gaza, which at that time was the world's main producer of frankincense, he sent to his tutor Leonidas 18 tons of frankincense and myrrh. Now, if there is ever a middle finger up to someone who told you that your ambitions were a bit too far-flung, sending them 18 tons of incense because they joked when you were an 8-year-old boy about you conquering spice-growing regions of the world is kind of it. We know that it's not that spite is a great motivator. I think it's being told you can't do something is a wonderful motivator, because either you're crushed by it, in which case, well, it's just mean. But quite often, and we find this in our teaching to some extent, the world, we never want to tell people they can't succeed. Telling them they can't succeed, counterintuitively, would probably help many of them succeed more. We don't tell them that they can't because, well, it's not being a nice human being, and it's not true in most cases. But many people would be able to rise to the challenge better if they were told they couldn't achieve something. I was told I couldn't get into Oxford, did it anyway. And did it in part because I was told I couldn't. It's such a powerful motivating force when people tell you you can't do things. But to send 18 tons of incense gives a nod to that. We don't even think it was a grudge Alexander held, but it tells you a lot about his character, that he remembered this rebuke from when he was 8 years old. Now, the taming of Bucephalus, I think, is such a wonderful story on so many levels. Comes to us through Plutarch. Arrian doesn't really deal with it. Alexander is somewhere between 8 and 13. He's a very young boy. You can see in this image, he's really quite small. And his father, is brought a stallion, and it's a stallion from Thessaly, so one of the places in the Greek world famed for its horses and for its horsemanship. And the horse breeder wants 13 talents for this horse. Now, for context, a talent is equal to about 26 kilograms of silver. And so really what's being asked for here is several £1 million for this horse. And so, like anyone who's going to pay millions of pounds for a horse today, King Philip, Alexander's father, wants to inspect it. And he inspects the horse and he gets his grooms to come and see if they can break the horse to make sure that it actually can be broken if you're going to pay all that much money for it. And despite the Macedonians at this point already being famed for their cavalry, despite him having grooms from Thessaly, if anywhere in the world you could find someone who could break this horse, it should be the court at Pella. And yet, none of them can. And they spend most of the morning trying to do this. And just as Philip kind of gives up and he tells the horse breeder to take the horse away, he doesn't want it. A young Alexander goes to his father and says, "Dad, please let me try." And Philip, and to some extent there's a cynicism here, and to some extent there's a real fear for his son's safety, kind of goes, well, sure, okay, we'll make a bet about it. If you tame the horse, you can keep it. What do I get if you fail? And Alexander says, well, it's okay, Dad, I'll give you the value of the horse, which tells you something about how rich the Kingdom of Macedon already was at the time. There's also a real risk to Alexander's safety, right? He's a very small boy, it's a very large horse. Anyone that's been around horses will know that they can be quite dangerous animals. And Alexander is the crown prince to the throne of Macedon. If he gets kicked in the head, if he dies as part of this endeavour that he doesn't need to embark on, the next in line is his half-wit, I think it was half-brother, full brother, half-brother. And the royal house of Macedon doesn't really continue in his absence. And so there's a real risk Philip takes it. But Philip says, you know what, go ahead, have a go. And Alexander, demonstrating that genius for which he later becomes famed, has recognised that this horse isn't actually belligerent and isn't trying very ardently to obfuscate people's attempts to tame him. He's just scared. And there's a real lesson in there for all of us that, I've written elsewhere that people's behaviour is rarely about us. And it's such a great example here with Bucephalus, that all of these men thought the horse was being obstinate and ox-headed, and actually, it's just scared. The same is true of many human beings and how they respond to things. And giving them the grace to understand they might be scared is probably a better way forward in many cases. But anyway, Alexander notices it's scared. He thinks it's scared of its own shadow, so he turns the horse to face the sun, can't see the shadow anymore, horse calms down. Alexander jumps on its back, rides around the palace. And when he comes back to his dad and dismounts the horse, his dad says, with what we can only imagine as a wry smile, "My son, when you grow up, you will have to find greater kingdoms than this, for Macedon will not hold you." And as much as Alexander as a son would outclips his father, there is a beautiful moment there, and I know people like Green will argue that it's not, but I think it's just the wrong interpretation. I see in that story a moment between father and son that, for all the disagreements that would come between them in later life before their reconciliation and Philip's early death, I really do see that as a moment between father and son of support for giving Alexander every advantage. It's something I see in my own life as well. My dad, both my parents, but my dad in particular, made great sacrifices, both to his own ideals and in terms of time and money, to give me the best possible advantages in life, in my schooling, in my education, and since I've embarked on my career. And it is a relationship that I really do value and cherish, and I see a reflection of that in the taming of Bucephalus. Now, the last thing that I want to come to is the Battle of Issus. Now, of the four great battles that Alexander fought, the Granicus, the Issus, the Battle of Gaugamela, and the Battle of the Hydaspes, I could have picked any of them. I chose the Issus for a very clear reason. Of all of them, it is the one he shouldn't have won the most. I mean, he had no right winning any of them. He had no right taking this small, out-of-the-way kingdom and conquering the Persian Empire. But of all the battles he shouldn't have won, he really shouldn't have won the Issus. Alexander had been bedridden for 2 weeks prior to the battle. His men marched 70 miles in 2 days to reach the front. He was outnumbered perhaps as many as 4 to 1. Some scholars put it at 2.5 to 3 to 1. Either way, he's massively outnumbered. King Darius, who is this figure just here, King Darius has as many Greek mercenaries in his army as Alexander has people in his entire army, full stop. This is Alexander over here, which is that image that was on the screen at the start of the lecture. And he just shouldn't have won. You take any kind of estimation, fighting in the environment he's fighting in against, the force he's fighting against, no right winning. And yet, he spots a weakness in the Persian line. He decides not to run away or to turn tail. He's cut off from his own people. Darius has managed to get behind him for various reasons that I won't go into right now. He's just in the most awful position you would want to be in. And yet, he sees this weakness in the Persian line on the flank. He takes cavalry across and makes cavalry charge through. Becomes more of a classic battle of encirclement. And while the Macedonians do suffer heavy casualties, he turns the tables on the greatest empire to walk the earth, at this time at least. And what we see in that is ambition, we see military genius, and we see the pothos that I talked about earlier, right? Faced with such overwhelming odds against you, most people who are more certainty-oriented, even if they've managed to convince themselves to take the risk to go to war with Persia, would still come to the conclusion that you don't fight. And that's not Alexander. And now we come to the heart of it. Alexander and Parmenio, pothos and prudence. And it's really summed up in this quote. So, between the Battle of Issus and the Battle of Gaugamela, King Darius of Persia makes various different entreaties. And at the last one, he offers to Alexander all of the land west of the Euphrates. He offers him the hand of his daughter in marriage, and really it's the most absurd offer. And as it arrives, Parmenio, who is Alexander's most eminent general, he is roughly 60 at the time the offer comes in. He's about 30 years older than, he's going to be 55. He's about 30 years older than Alexander. Parmenio, from kind of Philip's generation rather than Alexander's, looks at this and says, well, you know what? Were I Alexander, I'd accept this offer. That's my advice to you, my king. If I were Alexander, I would accept. And Alexander turns round and says, well, if I were Parmenio, so would I. And what we see there is that both men recognize that their worldviews are very different. And, I'll do a bit of a defense of Parmenio in a moment. But there are some key examples of where Parmenio is presented, at least in Arrian's account, as the foil to Alexander. So Alexander is full of pathos and yearning and driven and ambitious. And Parmenio is security-minded. Now, he's still a general. He's still an excellent soldier and military tactician. He's just not as driven to expand and conquer as Alexander is. And we see two examples of this. So the first is the Battle of the Granicus, so the first kind of engagement on Persian soil of Alexander's campaign. Parmenio cautioned against crossing the Granicus River until dawn so that they wouldn't be in a kind of weaker position. He thought trying to get over an entrenched opponent on an embankment was too risky, and Alexander decided to attack anyway. He said, no, I've got this. He launched an attack, withdraws from the attack, and as the enemy come down from the far bank of the Granicus to chase in pursuit, the companion cavalry race down the riverbed of the Granicus River and take them out. It's a fantastic victory. We also have this example, and we have others like it, and I'll talk about some more in a moment. But these two men are very different in their outlook and their worldview. But in defense of Parmenio, what can we say? Because he's not wrong, right? We've already said that Alexander shouldn't have won the Battle of the Granicus, or the Battle of the Issus, or the Battle of Gaugamela, or the Battle of Hydaspes. He probably shouldn't have won any of them. And yet he did. So, Alexander was, for all his success, incredibly lucky. Okay, he should have died twice at the Battle of Granicus. He takes a spear to the helmet that just reflects off, and his life is actually saved outright by Clytus the Black, who severs the arm of a man who's about to stab Alexander in the back. The whole thing could have been over as soon as it had started, and the Macedonians run back with their tail between their legs. But for the tides of fate within the maelstrom of battle. He also recovered from illness. So he almost died from a fever before the Battle of the Issus. Later on, he dies from an unknown illness. We don't know if it's the same and if it plagued him. But considering the conditions that Alexander campaigned in for so many years, the fact that he didn't contract dysentery or some other fever that killed him is quite remarkable. He also benefited from the fortuitous deaths of several of his enemies, particularly Memnon of Rhodes, who dies at sea of an unknown illness. We don't think Alexander poisoned him. I'm sure he would have loved to, but I don't think he was able to. And had Memnon of Rhodes been commanding the forces at the Issus instead of Darius, it's quite likely that Alexander may well not have won. He also really benefited from other people underestimating him. He's doing all these impossible things, and people don't expect it. It's like when he comes to lay siege to Tyre, which is out on an island, essentially an island off the coast. They think that they're impregnable because they're a walled fortress with high walls off the coast. How on earth is anyone going to lay siege to this island fortress? And Alexander builds a land bridge. He literally stacks up land and builds it out, and I believe it's still there today, that he builds this man-made land bridge, a feat of engineering that is phenomenal and was unheard of even by the people of Tyre, who were famed for their engineering themselves. There are also very real questions about Alexander's ability to run an empire. He does a great job conquering it, but we see the cracks starting to appear towards the end of Alexander's life. There is rebellion being started in Greece. We know that he has several issues with detractors in his own camp. He has to execute many of his rivals on at least one occasion. And the fact that his empire doesn't survive him. Alexander achieved so much in 33 years and then dies. And while his conquering of the Persian Empire left a lasting impact on the history of the world, that Macedonian line essentially ended with him. The empire breaks up. The Ptolemies in Egypt probably are the kind of longest lasting legacy of that. But the rest of it is broken up, and you fast forward a couple of hundred years. Well, who are the Macedonians now? And so, in defense of Parmenio, we have to say that even if Alexander was a fantastic conqueror, he possibly could have done with being a little more security-minded. Now, we turn and look at Aristotle. So, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about the idea of the golden mean. He says, we have virtues, and he lists several of them. I've taken Andrea as our example here. Kind of fits nicely with the theme of Alexander. And he says, Andrea, appropriate courage, is the mean between cowardice and rashness. So you can have a deficiency of a virtue, in this case cowardice, but you can also have an excess of a virtue, in this case, rashness. Excuse me. So, if we see, for example, an old lady being asked by, I don't know, a 10-year-old kid to hand over her mobile phone, you might think it appropriately courageous to walk over and intervene. If, however, it is 7 or 8 well-built men who clearly carry knives, it's probably not appropriately courageous to go over there and get yourself stabbed, right? It's probably more appropriately courageous in that context to take one of many other actions, calling the police being chief among them, because the risk of you not succeeding is incredibly high, unless you know, some kind of, I don't know, Jackie Chan, Tom Cruise kind of character. So sometimes courage is being more cowardly, and sometimes courage is being more rash. It's not like you're supposed to find the middle every time. That's not what the mean is. The mean changes depending on the situation you find yourself in. The goal is to practice over and over and over again until you can find the appropriate place for the mean in whatever situation you find yourself in. So, it's a bit like if any of you have ever zeroed a rifle. You adjust your sights, you fire a couple of rounds, you see where they land, you then adjust, you fire again, you've probably overcorrected a bit, you've now gone too far the other way, and you keep doing that process until you can accurately hit the mark every time. The same is true of virtue for Aristotle. Okay? Aristotle firmly believed you couldn't just be good because someone taught you the rule. Okay? You had to develop it over time, and that means necessarily that you get it wrong on a regular basis. Okay? It's not possible to be perfect straight off the bat, and even if you are, you won't be perfect consistently. So, 2 things to note. 1, the appropriate point for action, the appropriate mean, changes depending on the situation. You need more or less of an excess or a deficiency depending on the circumstances they present themselves. And second, you have to practice over and over and over again, and you're going to keep getting it wrong for a very long time. The goal is to try with the best of intentions to get better over time. So, The Dichotomy of Leadership. Excellent book. Jocko, Willink and Leif Babin's second book following on from Extreme Ownership. They talk about this idea. They don't ever mention Aristotle, but they're doing this Aristotelian endeavor. And they talk about holding the line, and they don't set it out like this, but this is the way to interpret what they're saying, is that holding the line, so giving a rule and then upholding that rule, in a leadership context is a virtue, right? Being able to hold a rule that you have set is probably a good thing. But at the same time, you can be too overbearing or too lenient in how you choose to do that. And they give 2 examples. Okay? So in one example, they talk in that book about the idea of patches. So military patches, worn on the arm, that in the SEAL teams there's generally apparently quite a lot of, because uniform regulations are a bit more lax. Some of them can be quite funny, occasionally quite rude, and they help kind of team morale. But the SEAL Team 6, particularly Task Unit Bruiser, which was Jocko's unit, was going to be deployed into Ramadi, Iraq, alongside US Marine Corps forces and US Army forces, which have much stricter uniform regulations. And the command came down that said, you can't wear patches because you're going to have these people take you seriously, and if your uniform is sloppy, they won't take you seriously. It's really important there that 2 things were given. There was a rule and a rationale for a rule. If ever you're just giving people rules and not explaining why, it's not going to last very long. Okay? Even if you built up a great deal of leadership capital, people still need to know that you're making reasonable and rational decisions. So, they give them the rule. And Jocko was really clear that there were to be no patches of any kind in his SEAL team or in his task unit. Fair enough. Now, his 2 subordinate officers, Leif and Seth Stone, between them decided that for as much as they respected Jocko and his views, he was wrong on this. Right? They heard the rationale and they thought he was wrong. So they kind of obeyed for the most part, but they had a task unit specific patch made up. And when they got out to Iraq, they handed them out to the guys, they put them on, and they hid them up whenever they were around US Army and US Marine Corps troops. But if they were out on their own on a mission or doing something, they'd take them off. They'd take the covering off so that the patches could be seen. Now, those subordinate commanders ardently expected that when Jocko found out, he would be particularly angry and may even sanction them for having broken a direct order. And yet, he never said a word. And as they were talking about it writing the book, they come to the conclusion that, well, Jocko knew. But he also knew that, well, okay, two things. One, the rationale for the rule had been incorporated into the action that the people decided to take. So even if the rule itself was broken, the rationale behind it, we might think of this as the jus lex distinction, that the idea of justice behind the rule is more important than the rule itself. And that they'd upheld, right? The patch was not in any way kind of inflammatory. It wasn't overly crass or anything like that. And they had the good sense to keep it covered up so that they still maintained this professional outward appearance in front of those units that they were working alongside. And so Jocko let it go. In that case, holding the line on the rule fell more towards the end of leniency. But they tell another example where during a particularly vital part of a mission, a radio stops working and the guys don't know how to reprogram their radios. And at that end, Jocko goes full kind of micromanagement, making sure that before they go out again, every single man can program his own radio after it's been scrambled up. Really quite overbearing generally, but so important because if your radio stops working and you're cut off from the rest of the group, or your squad is cut off from the rest of the group and you can't reprogram your radios, you're screwed, right? You're dead, your teammates are possibly dead. The consequences of not upholding that standard are really severe. And so what we see is that the appropriate mean for holding the line is a point that will vary depending on the circumstances, between being too lenient and being too overbearing. We see the same between Alexander and Parmenio, between Pothos and prudence. So, Parmenio, certainty-oriented, very much security-focused, and overly prudent, right? He thinks through things very carefully. He doesn't want to take unnecessary risk. He wants to consolidate what he's got before he moves forward. We also see that Alexander thrives on uncertainty. He has an unshakable faith in himself that makes him risk-minded, and by any reasonable estimation, he is reckless. It's not that being Alexander is good and being Parmenio is bad, right? If many of us tried to act like Alexander acted, we'd be dead from that first spear at the Battle of Granicus. It would be over, and that would be the end of our history. Okay? On the other hand, if we were on the other Parmenio, we'd never have left Macedon. So there's a balance to be found between these outlooks, right? Between the extremes of this driving on, this pothos that leads us to build an empire that's potentially unsustainable but gets us there, and between the security, nation stabilizing actions of someone like Parmenio, that there is an appropriate level of prudence that's needed. And for some of us, we're going to need to be a bit more like Alexander, and for some of us, we're going to need to be a bit more like Parmenio. Myself, I find myself generally more on Parmenio's side of things in my daily life, and that tells me that I need to be a bit more like Alexander. It's part of the recording and distribution of these lectures and the other things that I've been doing, is actually taking more risk in order to pursue what's meaningful. This also applies in other areas. I was reading the biography of George Washington the other day, and it talks about how when he's elected commander of the Continental Army at the Second Continental Congress, John Adams would later write, and it's a somewhat scathing letter about Washington, But he writes that one of the things that kind of cinched Washington the vote there to be the leader of the army was his silence. And we might find that odd. We tend to think of Washington as president and Washington as this military leader. And therefore he was the man with the ideas and the man with the plan and the man that was out there and forward working and doing all these wonderful things. And yes, George Washington was absolutely a man of action. But at the same time, in big meetings like the Continental Congresses, in the House of Burgess, in Virginia, Washington remained silent a great deal. And maybe, the Freemason in me wants to think it has something to do with Washington becoming a Freemason at 21, learning the value of silence. It's part of the coat of arms of the United Grand Lodge of England. Aude vide tace, part of a longer quote, Aude vide tace, si vivere in pace. Hear, see, and be silent if you would live in peace. And the idea there is that silence is another one of these things we might consider a virtue. If you say too little, people think you have nothing to say and they don't look to you. But if every time something comes up, you give your opinion on it, you devalue the quality of what you say. Even if what you're saying is great and productive, to talk all the time still limits how high of an esteem people have for your words when you use them. Right? Give me an example. There are many things in my professional life that I see that I don't disagree with necessarily, but I think could be done differently. You don't talk about most of those things because most of them are not important enough to matter in the grand scheme of things. It's something that I try really hard to work at because when I speak, I want to make sure that the words I'm using are appropriate and received in the right way. And quite often I will not speak for an extended period. Naturally, in the course of teaching, we do an awful lot of talking. But in strategic decision-making and many other things, trying to emulate Washington to this extent of make sure that when you choose to say things, those things are powerful and meaningful. And otherwise, don't say them. Counterintuitive, I know, for someone who has just launched into social media and content production as part of what I do, but I still think it's true. I think social media is the wrong environment in which to be silent. I don't think it works in that forum. But certainly in meeting rooms where we're working out decisions and forward planning and trying to be constructive and all of those things. Actually, keeping your view to yourself unless asked for it or unless the issue at hand is one that you are really passionate about, I think is vitally important, and definitely another area where we see this dichotomy, this balance, this recognizing that the right course of action falls between two extremes is a really helpful model. On Instagram the other day, I was asked this question about how do I balance pushing myself and giving myself grace when needed? And I see it in exactly the same way I see all these other things. I get it wrong a great deal of the time. I get better over time, but I get it wrong an awful lot. And what I mean by that is that, there are times in my life when I've got it seriously wrong. There was a time during my work at a software company where I was hospitalized with a partially collapsed lung from a lung infection. And the doctor said, people at 23, 24 don't get lung infections that partially collapse their lung. Like, what's going on? And working to great extent in many of the things that I was doing. Same is true, and every year in teaching, particularly in my own life, and it's true in most jobs, there's a part of the year that is the most challenging professionally. And at that time of year, I get this wrong, right? I get it wrong. And I play a game where we're trying to last as long as we can without needing to take time off and hope that that takes you to the next school break. So this lecture is being recorded on the Easter break. It's been a really tough Easter term. That's fine, that's how these things go. But you play the game, right? So traditionally, as someone who wakes up really early, I have not woken up very early for the past week because there has been a real need to ensure that I can make it through to the end. And you have to play that game over and over again enough times throughout the course of your life that you get to a point where you can judge it more appropriately. I take less time off work now than I used to for several reasons, but one of them is learning how far you can push yourself before you have to take a step back. I have a whole lecture that will be recorded at another point about managing stress and the importance of recovery, and it is the same. I see it in exactly the same way, that there is a scale and a balance, and that finding the right place in that between this push yourself to succeed and give yourself enough grace when you actually need it is a balance. Because if you take too much grace, you never achieve anything, you end up lazy, eating Doritos, sat on a beanbag, playing Xbox 24 hours a day. It might make a good single day of real recovery. I'm not even sure 24 hours of straight Xbox would do that. But on the other hand, working until you die of a heart attack very young is not really in service of anyone. And so there has to be balance. And you play that game of tug of war with your ability to complete more work and your ability to recover from doing more work over and over and over again. And very much like trying to zero in on a target, you're going to get it wrong lots of the time. And each time you approach a new problem or a new phase, I'm about to become a dad, that's going to present its own challenges. I'm going to get this wrong even more. Because a change in circumstances is a bit like changing the scope on a rifle. You have to go through the process again of trying to work out where that right balance is. So, in answer to the question, you work it out through practice and through getting it wrong over and over and over again throughout the course of your life. And depending where you tend to fall on that spectrum, you want to try and earn more on one side or the other, right? So as someone who historically has regularly erred too much on the side of working too much and then becoming ill or having to take time off, for me, that means over the past couple of years being inclined more towards recovering more. But for other people, that will be more like actually doing more. Push yourself until you actually feel you can't do any more, because you might be capable of far more than you think you currently are capable of. But if you've never tested that limit, you'll never know. So, where do you need to act to find a better balance? It's a question that only you can answer for yourselves. It is part of a guide that I wrote on pursuing your hierarchy of value, and in a moral and philosophy of life kind of sense, that's true. But as we've seen, these virtues apply so many places, from silence to appropriate rest and recovery to pothos and prudence themselves. If you'd like to see that guide, there'll be a link in the description, and there's one on my Instagram profile, and it helps you set out through 16 different areas of value that I think human beings have, how and where and why you can proceed forward, and gives you some tips and a structure to do so. And so to finish today, I want to finish with this quote. Okay, just that image of the two extremes. And in this case, historically, we know which one is right. Before the Battle of Gaugamela, we know Alexander is right here. We know he can actually do it. He didn't. He thought he could. He had this unshakable faith in himself. But he could very easily have lost to the greatest army the world had ever seen. And if he had, we wouldn't remember him anywhere near as much as we do. Okay? We may even remember his father as Philip the Great rather than him as Alexander the Great. And so, when you come to approach areas in your life, and when you come to look at things that maybe are unfamiliar, or maybe are things you've gotten wrong in the past, remember that there is a spectrum. There will be an excess of action and a deficiency of action, and the appropriate place is rarely one extreme or the other. But how far it lends itself to one or the other will depend on the circumstance, on where you find yourself at the time you come to do that. And you're going to get it wrong a great deal. And the goal over time is to get it wrong enough times you start to get it right. So don't beat yourselves up about it. Just accept that, very much like how Aristotle says human beings must learn to be virtuous, you have to learn to govern and run your own lives in the same way, through trial and error, getting it wrong over and over and over again. until you find a better balance. Thank you. Be a good human.